Good afternoon, everyone. I'm calling to order our meeting of the Housing Policy and Development Committee. I'm Cam Gordon, Chair of the committee. I'm joined today by committee members Kevin Reich, Lisa Bender, Jeremy Schrader, and Jeremiah Ellison, who's Vice Chair of the committee. The committee has 4 items today, 1 discussion item, 1 consent item, and 2 public hearings that I think we'll consider one public hearing because it's about the same project but has to do with 2 different financing methods. First, we'll take the consent item. This is a grant application to the Metropolitan Council Livability Communities Demonstration Account, authorizing submission and priority ranking of the grant applications for the pre-development program for the Upper Harbor Terminal Site project. Anybody want to pull that for discussion or comment? Questions? Seeing none then, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, say no. That motion carries. Then next we can move on to our public hearing, our public hearings, and this has to do with the Lake Street housing. One of them is the Phase 1 bond issuance, and there's also a tax increment financing plan, and maybe we can get the presentation on both of those together. Does that sound good? All right, thank you.
Thank you, Chair Gordon. Happy spring, everybody. The reports in front of you today represent the final 2 funding approvals needed to move this project forward to closing. Lake Street Housing Phase 1 will be located at the intersection of West Lake Street and Harriet Avenue South in the Whittier neighborhood of South Minneapolis in Ward 10. The project will include 111 units of rental housing affordable to households at or below 60% AMI. Specifically, the project includes a mix of 0, 1, and 2-bedroom units, 66 of which will be affordable at or below 60% AMI, 42 units affordable at or below 50% AMI, and 3 units affordable at or below 30% AMI. Of all of those units, there are also 6 units of permanent supportive housing for homeless and disabled veterans, and 3 set aside for Hennepin County Human Services and public health clients. The project also features a number of amenities, including a bicycle storage and repair station for the residents, underground parking, a green roof, ground floor walk-up units fronting Harriet Avenue, a community room, a pet grooming station for the residents, an hour car, pedestrian scale lighting, and business and fitness centers. The project will revitalize what is currently vacant and underutilized land into a robust, higher density, transit-oriented housing development. The total development costs for the project are currently estimated at $27,754,662. Developer equity into the project includes a deferred developer fee in the amount of $500,000 and a seller note in an amount of approximately $642,000. The total developer fee is $2,252,219 and is in compliance with our developer fee policy. With respect to the bond financing, which is the first item up for the public hearing, the developer has requested, and staff are recommending approval of the issuance of up to $13.5 million in tax-exempt multifamily housing entitlement revenue bonds. The bond allocation enables the project to meet the required 50% test, and the bonds would be issued in 2 series. Series A bonds will be permanent debt to the project in an amount of approximately $11.4 million, and the Series B bonds are an amount in an amount of approximately $2.1 million and are representative of the construction loan. The bonds will generate about $9.3 million in tax credit equity, which acts as a source of funds to the project. The current status of the city's entitlement is shown in the table in your report, and the additional financing information is included on the project data worksheet, which is also in your packet. Chair Gordon, do you want me to go on and talk about the TIF financing as well?
Yes, that would be great. Thank you.
All right. With respect to the tax increment financing, the developer has submitted an application for, I'm sorry, pardon me. I'm sorry. The developer has submitted an application for, I apologize, I have lost a page. I certainly did. Well, we'll just go right to the report. Forgive me, I apologize.
That's just fine, no worries.
Again, the total development costs for the project are just over $27 million. Developer equity into the project of $500,000. And the developer fee of the $2.5 million. The developer has requested pay-as-you-go TIF assistance from the city to help pay for eligible construction costs associated with the project. The Lake Street TIF housing plan establishes a new housing TIF district, and pending city council approval, the city will issue a pay-as-you-go tax increment note in the amount of $1.397 million to the project. The pay-as-you-go note does not obligate the city to make payments to the note holder beyond the payment of 90% of the tax increment generated by the project. The attached tax increment plan provides a detailed breakdown of how the increment will be distributed and used. And the plan was transmitted for the required 45-day review on February 22nd, 2019. We did not receive any comments. I'm happy to stand for questions, and the developer's representatives are here as well.
I don't see any questions right now, so I appreciate the report, and I think we can open the public hearing and see if anybody wants to come up and speak on this matter. Is there anybody here who'd like to speak on this? Seeing no one come forward, then I'll close the public hearing, and I'll call on Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to move these items for approval.
Excellent, thank you.
Sure, and I could comment briefly.
Sure.
These are in Ward 10, or this project is in Ward 10 that are covered under items 1 and 2. And the project has been through some pretty significant changes, both in terms of its design, responding to neighborhood and community feedback, as well as changing the levels of affordability and the population served. And I think both of those kinds of changes have made the project really exciting. And I particularly want to note Ward 10 is home to the, I think, only active VFW resource in the city, the VFW Hall, which folks maybe know because they go sing karaoke there or whatever. Or sometimes we have Ward 10 community meetings, but it's actually a really important resource in our community. I'm really excited that this project, which, I mean, it's a little far away, but it's pretty close in the proximity of the neighborhood, is an opportunity for partnership with them and to really build on that resource that we have in Ward 10 for folks who are veterans, and it's just our opportunity to help meet our state's goals of eliminating veterans homelessness. So I'm excited for the project overall and that component in particular.
Well, thank you very much for those comments. I don't see any other questions or comments. So on the motion to approve both of these items, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, say no. That motion carries. Now we can move on to our final discussion item. This is the Memorandum of Understanding with Minneapolis Public Housing Authority related to public housing subsidy conversions. Welcome, Ms. Brennan.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Andrea Brennan. I'm Director of Housing Policy and Development in CPED. On December 7th, December 7th, 2018, the City Council adopted a resolution establishing guiding principles in support of investments in public housing and the people who live there. On December 7th, 2018, the City Council also directed staff to negotiate a memorandum of understanding with Minneapolis Public Housing Authority that is consistent with the resolution establishing the guiding principles, and to bring that back to the Housing Policy and Development Committee. So that's what we're doing today. And the Memorandum of Understanding before you recognizes a couple of sort of key elements here. One of which is that the federal government has, for decades, underfunded the capital needs of public housing. I don't think we'd be here today discussing this if that were not the case. We also acknowledge that the federal government in the last handful of years has created public housing subsidy conversion opportunities that may allow for increased federal subsidies necessary to repair and renovate public housing units. We also recognize that MPHA is exploring the use of these potential subsidy conversion tools, and that we have heard from residents of Minneapolis Public Housing Authority units that there's some concern with the use of these conversion tools, especially as it relates to continued public ownership and or control of this really critical, important housing resource for the city. The purpose of the MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, from the city's perspective is to establish conditions for city support, financial or otherwise, for public housing preservation involving these subsidy conversion tools. Specifically, the conditions relate to and include public ownership and or control. So that's really fundamental to this memorandum of understanding, is that in any scenario, to articulate the city's very strong interests and condition of further support, that there be continued public ownership and or public control of, again, this really critical housing asset. Second, conditions related to post-redevelopment protections for residents. And third, the requirements that are part of all of these subsidy conversion tools, requirements for resident consultation and protection. So those are the key elements of this memorandum of understanding. I'd also like to acknowledge that we have Tracy Scott, Deputy Executive Director of MPHA here, and her colleagues Lisa Griebel and Jeff Horwitz are certainly able to answer any questions you have, as am I.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much. I don't see any questions right now. Would anybody from MPHA like to make a statement? Oh, Councilmember Warsami, sorry. Would you like to, is this a question?
Thank you, Chair, for letting me speak at your committee. We've been working on this MOU for a while, but I want to ask a couple of questions to Andrea. One, we did a resolution a while back, and I think some people interpreted it as if we, the city, gave a green light to RAD. Can you speak on that it wasn't about that and we don't have a role to do that on our behalf? And also the MOU, the intention of it is to protect tenants and also to protect public housing to stay public. So if there is a conversion, when or if that we have these protection mechanisms for our tenants. So can you speak on that a little bit, please?
Sure, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, Councilmember Warsami. The title of the resolution, I think, is meaningful in that it's establishing guiding principles in support of investments in public housing and the people who live there. Mm-hmm. And yes, you are correct. The subsidy conversion tools that are available to public housing authorities, that are being used by public housing authorities around the country, are just that. They're just tools. The city is not the use of those tools do not require city approval, so the city is not in a position to either approve them or not approve them. So the intention here of the resolution is to just state the city's position that the key elements of what the city really wants to protect is this housing resource for the people who are living there, and however, recognizing that public housing in the city does have capital needs. It does require funding. There are needed improvements that need to be made now and in the future. And understanding that subsidy conversion tools are under consideration. But the resolution and the MOU doesn't say that it's a good idea or a bad idea to use these tools. They both just state the city's position that the key fundamental principle here is protection of existing tenants.
Okay. Mr. Chair, if I
Go
may
ahead.
follow up. And also, we're not pioneers in the city of Minneapolis or Minneapolis Public Housing Authority of us, housing authority of our city is not a pioneer in this process. Can you talk about our neighboring city of St. Paul and what they're doing and give a bit of context about that as well?
Sure, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Warsame. I'm actually going to ask Tracy and see if she'd be willing to come up and speak to that. I think she could speak better to that than me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Committee, and Councilmember Warsame. Your question was about whether or not we're pioneers, and I'm almost embarrassed to say no, we're not, on this issue. I'd like to be pioneering in terms of the way that we can use our resources wisely and creatively to benefit our community. But in this case, on RAD in particular, there have been 111,000 units across the country that have already been converted with public housing residents who were there before and have moved back. And in terms of the RAD process, locally, St. Paul has applied for conversion of almost their entire public housing portfolio. And Dakota County, I understand, is also in the process of applying for conversion of their portfolio. So we're just applying right now for one building, and we look towards the future to see whether it's applicable for other properties in the future.
Okay. I want to ask a follow-up question, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, are you, in terms of public housing, are you trying to kick out your tenants? Are you trying to make them homeless? Is there something that we haven't heard about, that these tenants, especially the Elliott twins, are they going to be displaced? Are they going to be kicked out?
The process that we've proposed with the rental assistance demonstration, otherwise known as RAD, is a HUD process for converting the subsidy from public housing to a voucher-based source of funds. It is a preservation strategy, and in fact, HUD has been proposing that more housing authorities use it in order to preserve the funds and preserve the public housing for those residents.
All right. Thank you.
Councilmember Reich has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just sort of following through with some of Warsame's inquiries, and I think it's giving voice to a lot of issues and concerns. Not only are we trying to express what we value as a city in terms of our housing portfolio, but we're also sort of giving some voice to issues and concerns that we've heard from constituents, sometimes in a rather heated and pointed manner. So just exploring a few detailed questions. And so from ownership to what's less than ownership, control. Is that a wiggle word, or is there a similarity that would be comforting to those who might be still skeptical, if not critical?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Reich, the way that I think that there are, it gets a little complicated in the sense of some of the public housing subsidy conversion tools, some of the public housing that use those tools may also use other tools, financing tools, such as the low-income housing tax credit program. And in those cases, the ownership structure of that particular financing tool requires that there is whoever is purchasing those tax credits is part of the ownership entity. So for a period of time, which typically is 15 years, there is the possibility of having ownership that includes private ownership as well as some element of public ownership, most likely, or nonprofit ownership. So whether it technically is owned by the MPHA there may potentially be a scenario where MPHA has control of a nonprofit owner that is part of the ownership entity, but technically it's not, wouldn't be defined as public ownership. So that's why we use the terminology of public control in the resolution, in the memorandum of understanding, is to try to be technically accurate in anticipation of there's likely to be, in some of these, in some public housing units, another financing tool such as the low-income housing tax credit. And my understanding of the overall strategy is that the tax credit financing is likely not to be used for all of these preservation efforts, but that could come into play, and that's why it technically probably wouldn't be accurate to say that it's 100% public ownership.
So we'd have a scenario chain of ownership, but there would be some mechanism of control, and that would be a durable and enduring control mechanism, however that's defined legally.
Yes, that's the idea.
Good. Just wanted to get that clarification for the record. I think it's a very key point, and obviously a key point just in here we are trying to explain to people who are very engaged in this topic matter. Think of how we might have to boil that down and communicate it to lay people or people in the public who might have a concern, but we have to boil it down to have a quicker sort of way to explain it perhaps, or take the time to layer our explanation so we can get to a conclusion where we have mutual understanding. So I'm glad we got
Right.
this on the record to begin that conversation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome. I have a couple questions, too. This MOU would only come into play, it says here, when the city has any financial support with regard to the public housing efforts. Is that likely for most projects, or was that going to be rare? And could you tell us a little bit more about what the financial support would include?
Sure, Mr. Chair. The right now, my understanding, and again, Tracy can perhaps speak in more detail to this issue, but MPHA is undergoing a comprehensive strategy for the preservation needs of the entire portfolio. And I think it's our understanding that there will be the need for some form of city support in some aspect of that preservation strategy. That could come in the form of city, support for the use, for example, of its tax-exempt bonding allocation and allocation of 4% low-income housing tax credits that I referred to earlier. But until we see that sort of broad portfolio strategy, we don't have any more detail at this point about the level of financial requests that will be before the city in the future.
Do we think there'll be some city financial support required for the Elliott Twins project?
Mr. Chair, my understanding is that they're one of the scenarios that's being considered for the Elliott Twin renovation and preservation project is the use of tax-exempt bonding authority and 4% tax credit equity. So in that case, those would be resources that would be allocated by the city if that were to be approved.
Okay, I appreciate that. The two parts that I liked best out of the MOU include the public ownership piece and then also the right of first refusal. The public ownership piece includes many different options, and it says that MPHA will commit to using one or a combination of the following. And the one thing that I see there that seems to really call out public ownership is the long-term ground lease. I guess I'm concerned that if they only had to choose one, and there's actually, it looks like there's 8 of them, I don't know, I wish it was stronger and I wish it was clearer that their public ownership would be maintained in these ways, and the ground lease, of where the MPHA would hold the land and they would never even let the nonprofit entity control that, is some assurance. But it looks like they don't necessarily have to do that with every project. Maybe you could just kind of talk about the safeguards of those 8 and how they might
Sure.
work together and differently, and why there's 8 different ways to get at that.
Sure, Mr. Chair. One of the purposes of this memorandum of understanding is to establish in more detail than what has been discussed previously, mechanisms for this public ownership, public control going forward. And it's just as much for future staff and future policymakers to have as a reference point. But it's anticipated that, or required rather, that when the city is considering specific financial assistance to any one of these preservation efforts, that will be an opportunity for the city to use this as sort of the guiding document, but to make sure that in those documents related to those specific financing programs that these things are locked down. And so I think that there are too many different possibilities to be that prescriptive in a general memorandum of understanding that applies to an overall portfolio strategy. So that's why there are, there's more than just one path. But the process would be that upon request for any financial involvement on the part of the city, we would use this to make sure that the documents related to city financial assistance required ongoing public ownership and control and/or control. Did I
And so-
answer your question?
I think so. I think we'll still have to look at those options. What you're telling me then is we, at least somebody from the city, will have another opportunity to come back and say, which of the 8 did you choose out of this menu and why? And we want more than that or not, or that's some, gives us some options and choices to see what fits. Just to get clarity then, whenever we were giving that financial assistance, would the council then hear about it again and see what this agreement was and what the terms that would be used out of this general MOU would be put in that, and we'd be approving each one of those one at a time?
Mr. Chair, yes, that is correct.
Okay, I think that's important. And so could everybody please memorize all of these and make sure when it comes up again, you have a quick reference to them and all right. You'll help us remember anyway. I appreciate that. I don't see, I do see now another question. Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I more wanted to make a comment, and I don't know how much we want to belabor this every time we end up talking about it, but I appreciate this approach, which has tried to put forward our basic standards for how we hope and expect folks in our community who are living in public housing to be treated. And I know everything I've heard from MPHA is that they've enthusiastically embraced these basic ideas as well. I think some of the most important things here are maintaining public control over the land, and then, of course, the protections specific to people in the housing. But I mean, I was a toddler when the federal government started walking away from investing in public housing, and now I'm a city council member trying to figure out what the city of Minneapolis can do in the face of growing income inequality, federal minimum wage that has stagnated, communities that have been disinvested in, and so I just think it's important to just remember that context and frankly demand as cities across the country that we see better investment from the federal government in particular, but other levels of government in housing that is actually affordable to the people who live in our community, because of all of the other things that we're having to absorb. Funding public housing in the city of Minneapolis for people living in the city of Minneapolis is not sustainable for us as a city. And I just think we have to keep saying that because it's true. And, we have to raise our expectations for what we hope and expect our federal leaders to be doing. Thank you.
Appreciate that. Councilmember Ellison.
I just want to 100% co-sign everything that the council president just said. I like the MOU because it shows that our partners over at MPHA are sort of signing up for a little bit of accountability because MOUs are mutual, and so I do want to thank MPHA for signing the MOU. And I also want to thank Councilmember Warsame, and I know Council Vice President Jenkins for working on the MOU. But I don't want this to be taken as a sign that the city supports the idea of conversions, and the MOU doesn't state that. And I know that I get the practical reality of why our public housing authority sort of has to look at this as a serious option. I understand the practical reality of funding and repairing these units, but I also share the concern that we are chipping away at our public infrastructure. And again, that comes back to what level is the federal government willing to put in to make sure that people have affordable housing. And I'm glad that our local agency is showing at least more effort and sophistication on that front than our federal government. But I don't inherently support the idea of conversions. I'm a little troubled that HUD is recommending that we do that. And so I just wanted that to be on record, that this MOU is a way for the city to sort of state its value in terms of protecting tenants and in terms of making sure that we maintain public ownership, but it's by no means an endorsement of conversions broadly. And so just wanted that to be on the record for the public and for our partners at the local agency here. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I appreciate that. I'd be happy to co-sign that, if that's all right. So, I wanted to know. Oh, Councilmember Warsame.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to co-sign what Councilmember Ellison just said, and what Council President Bender also mentioned as well. I'm a supporter of public housing, and I've been on the record before. I grew up on government subsidized housing, and if it wasn't for that, me and my 5 younger siblings would not have survived. So I understand what it means to folks that live in public housing. And also, I want to also be on the record to say, I want the federal government to fully fund our public housing. And we should, through our IGR department, work on that as a body. And I know every single council member here had concerns about the conversion, and we're not here endorsing the conversion. What we're doing is we're being proactive in the protection of our tenants and in the protection of our public housing stock. And what we're saying in this memorandum, and I appreciate Minneapolis Public Housing Authorities, they're a separate entity, and yet they came in and co-signed this with us. And it was through long deliberations. It hasn't been easy. And through the brilliant work of our city staff, we come to this, guiding document. I have folks at the Elliott Twins who are afraid that they're going to be displaced. They're afraid. They've been told they were going to be kicked out in February. Now they're going to be kicked out in May, and then they're going to be kicked out in November. They are afraid though. And this document, I can go back, knock on every single door, and tell them, you should believe the Public Housing Authority because they said you're not going to be displaced. And the city of Minneapolis, myself, and all the other council members are supporting your right to live in your units. I think that message, that clarity, will help a lot of us talk to our residents. And I have 17 housing units in my ward. I have relatives live in public housing. These are people who are near and dear to my heart. So I really appreciate the work that has been done and the fact that Minneapolis Public Housing Authority also stepped up, and came to the table and had to go through this process. So really appreciate everybody's work and the support of my colleagues here as well. Thank you.
So I also wanted to note that Councilmember Warsame and I are scheduling a community meeting to get some input. The one thing that I'd like to do is get more input from people on this, or at least a chance for them to review it a little bit more. And you'll notice I didn't decide to take any comment at committee. It didn't seem in the appropriate place necessarily or the time, but we're working on finding a location for April 17th. It could be at Matthews Park. It might be at the Cedars. We're looking at a couple spots, so we'll make sure to publicize that. What I'd like to do today is move it forward without recommendation so that we have a chance to at least vet it a little bit longer and then bring it back to the council meeting. I know that Councilmember Warsame is anxious to get this approved in timing with what's happening in his ward with Elliott Twins, so I'm not trying to delay that schedule at all, but I will make that motion to move it forward without recommendation, noting that we'll have a community meeting on the 17th. Any questions or discussion on the motion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? That motion carries. And seeing no further business before us, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everybody.